Hello everyone, Dr. Samantha Cottrell here for the Imagining a New We video blog, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. This is Bee. She's very grumpy that I've been doing so many conversations today, but the conversations have been so great that she will forgive me, I'm sure, when she hears them. So I've been doing a few of these Source Saturday series. The Source Saturday series is a series where I'm talking with historians and archivists and creators about different primary sources and talking through them so that we can see how historians understand primary sources. And then within that series, I've been talking to people on different themes. And this particular video is really fantastic because it is one of three related to this collection, this book collection on women in World War II. And it's really exciting to be able to connect with the editors of the collection, but also some of the authors about ways that we can think about women's involvement in World War II as not just was it good for them or bad for them, but the nuances of it. Like all of the other thematic series, this little 1-minute introduction is the same for all. We'll go to an introduction to the person that I'm speaking to, and then we'll go to our great video on the different sources. In this video, I am talking with Dr. Amy Shaw. Amy is the co-editor of this collection along with Dr. Sarah Glassford, and they also co-edited another book with UBC Press on women in World War I. Amy's background is actually in World War I history, specifically related to conscientious objectors, and she is a professor in history at the University of Lethbridge, which is really great to be able to bring that history background related to conscientious objectors to these collections on women in World War I, and today, as we're talking about in World War II. I'm really excited to be able to talk to Amy as a co-editor of this collection about the themes that her and Sarah wanted to be able to bring to a collection like this and what the collection as a whole can now contribute to understanding women in World War II. So let's go over to Zoom and talk to Amy. Amy, I'm so excited to be able to talk with you. It looks so sunny there, and I think that's because of the time change. It looks like it's midnight here, but we're only a couple hours difference. I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about this collection. I talked with a couple authors and author/co-editor Sarah Glassford, and I just think it's a really, really valuable collection, and I'm so glad that we're able to talk about it. So thank you for doing this for me.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I think it's going to be...
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, sure. My name's Amy Shaw, and I teach history at the University of Lethbridge. And I have a particular interest in thinking about sort of citizenship and gender, especially in wartime. So I've done a little bit of work on conscientious objection in the First World War. And with Sarah Glassford, we've co-edited 2 collections now on women and girls of Canada and Newfoundland during the 2 World Wars. So we've just finished our sequel to the First World War, and it's called A Terrible Price to Pay. So we're really excited about that.
Yeah, and I'm really excited that we're going to be able to talk about the collection as a whole, because I know that you and Sarah wanted to do some different things with the scholarship in this book. You didn't just want to kind of say the same things or the same narratives about women during World War II. You wanted to be able to kind of push the boundaries of how we understand women during this period. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, we weren't totally sure what we were going to do when we set out to do this. We wanted to see what work was being done out there. So we just sort of put out a call for papers and then looked at what we got. And we've got some really interesting work. We ended up sort of grouping what we had into 4 sections. And so we've got a section that's on women, children in the war. So that's looking at sort of how young people experience the war. We've got the first chapter looking at childhood in some of the sort of Atlantic port cities where, you know, you could look out and see battleships in the harbor and things like that, a place where the war was much more sort of physically present than in the rest of Canada. A great article on these friendships between British girls evacuated to Canada with Canadian girls, an article on day nurseries, so putting together, you know, daycare, which doesn't really have a long history in Canada during the Second World War, and a great article that's comparing French and English school children in Quebec, girls' school. So that's our first section. We've got a section on the war at home, which is looking at some of the things that we see happening on the home front. So there's one article looking at the experience of Canadian Jewish women, which is, I think you're speaking to the author of that in one part.
Yeah, yeah, we do have a video with Jennifer and some oral history interviews and photographs she shared about Canadian Jewish women, and that was a really great conversation.
Oh, great. Yeah. It's so good because it's something that so little has been done on, surprisingly, really, considering sort of the resonance of the Second World War around that. And then we've got a couple of chapters that are looking at consumption on the war front. Graham Broada and Joseph Tohill taking sort of different approaches to looking at this. And this was something that was really presented as one of women's key roles in the war. What you buy, how you run your home as being a home front, a front of the war. We've got a chapter on women overseas, where it's not looking at women overseas in the military, but are looking more at sort of humanitarian work. So Sarah's got some of her work on the Red Cross, and we've got some work on pacifists, on anti-war Mennonites working overseas to try to alleviate some of the suffering caused by the war. So these are great because they're quite sort of unusual things that haven't been studied all that much before.
And Sarah and I talked specifically about her chapter, so that is another video people can watch.
Yeah, it's so great that you have this series. Yeah. And the last one looks at some of the areas that we do tend to know a little bit more about. I think when people think of the Second World War, they might think of enlisted women or women in factories with the bandana and the overalls. And nursing maybe, but these are coming at them from quite different directions. So our chapter on nursing is looking at nursing at home in Labrador in this instance, where we have a shift coming from where a hospital becomes run almost entirely by women, and some of the shifts happening there. We've got looking at, the war dead, how they talk about death, because they often don't. Again, thinking about danger and protection in factories. So I think we've got a lot of really interesting chapters in there, and I think it was just so much fun editing it and putting them together and seeing all the connections in this.
And so many of these, you know, so often when we look at an edited book collection, or if not, like I think about my undergrad when I got book collections as part of undergrad courses, and then when I bought like a different version of the book 5 or 10 years later, so many of the articles seemed the same. Like there didn't seem like there was, like it seemed like it was more like rehashing the same arguments rather than coming up with new scholarship. But I really think a lot of these articles are bringing in new sources and new analysis because of that. Is that true? Is that kind of feeling based on these titles accurate?
I think so. That's what we were definitely trying to do. And there, I don't know, should I talk about sort of what the state of World War II women's historiography has been and where we're trying to go with that, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's really valuable because so often I find in classrooms, because we know certain stories, because we're introduced to them in our undergrad, because we were introduced to them in high school and then in elementary school, we get trapped in the same type of story. And so often we don't realize how that is a story that was created, like a grand narrative that we can work our way out of, not just like this natural story. And so if you want to like make apparent the story that we are often like trapped in, that might be a good way of positioning ourselves in this, in understanding this collection.
Yes, yeah, good. Well, one of the things that's sort of interesting about the way we think about women in the Second World War is that there's kind of two stories. I think the image that many people have is this kind of Rosie the Riveter, we can do it, right? That we have all these sort of propaganda posters, and it's really popular now. You can own on T-shirts, and there's the Bomb Girls TV show, and this is a sense that we have of the war. And from that, there's a certain sense of women showing their abilities, and this kind of leading into maybe greater equality in the 60s and 70s. Academics have often kind of challenged this, though. So we have a popular thread of history, and then a thread where people in universities are saying, yes, it looks like that. The documents that we have, the propaganda posters and stuff, make it look like that. But really, the government didn't want there to be big changes. They wanted this to be just for now. Women are going to step up and do some things maybe that they hadn't done before. But then after the war, they're supposed to go back in their home. And then we have, you know, the 50s, where we have whatever, this stereotype of June Cleaver vacuuming in her pearls and her high heels, that this was meant to be kind of temporary. So we have these two kinds of threads here about whether this made big changes or whether this didn't make big changes. And that was one of the things that we had to kind of figure out how to deal with in this collection, is this kind of controversy or stress or something. And we decided that the thing to try to do is just sort of let women speak for themselves. Just look at the documents and see what they said. That if a woman said, I had the time of my life, we can't say to her, no, you're wrong, you didn't, this was actually bad for you long term. And if a woman did have a hard time, not to say, no, you were all pulling together and you know, having a great time together. So trying to sort of put that forward. Because obviously women had thousands of different experiences of the war, right? There's a lot of different people here. If you're a Japanese woman interned, your experience of the war is very different from if you're, I don't know, a woman who enlisted in the Navy, or if you're a mother who's trying to take care of her children at home in a time of rationing while grieving her brother who has died or something. Like, there's so many different experiences of the war. So we're trying to let the document speak do that. I feel like I'm raging on too long.
No, I like, it's so cool that you said that, because when I spoke to Sarah and Jen about their chapters, they said very similar things. And I mean, you all worked on the collection together, but you certainly didn't rehearse us talking. And like Jennifer was saying, you know, one of the things that was like behind her chapter was talking against a dominant view of Jews during World War II, women who were Jewish during World War II, that like they weren't involved, that wasn't the case. And she was like, I want to speak back to that. And she did that specifically through oral history interviews, which, I mean, how much more voice can you get from women? And Sarah too was saying, like, we don't look at these letters as these like important historical documents until we look at them as important historical documents, and we see that like it may be like a banal discussion of our muff or our winter coat, we're actually seeing the performance and need for care and going back and forth. And like when we are listening to what those women are saying, we can see some of those, or we can hear some of those things. And so often, you know, women's voices are silenced in the archives because like those experiences weren't identified as being significant in the same way that men's experiences were, kind of in this broad way. And so by allowing those women and the sources to be able to speak to what they're saying, of course that provides that nuance on the historical period, which is such an important way for us to understand our own understandings of gender in the present, but also how gender operated in the past as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very good. There's often been a sense that the story of war is the story of soldiers who are men, who are away. And what I think we're finding out more now is that, it's everywhere. People at home are also having changed lives because of the war, and it's worth looking at, and it's very interesting and helps us understand society so much to look at that. Yeah.
It's interesting because for Remembrance Day, I also talked to a couple of historians that weren't part of this collection on other letter collections, and I spoke to Stephen Davies from the Canadian Letters and Images Project, and he highlighted a letter and then the response letter from the soldier overseas, and then his wife. And Stephen was really highlighting, like, we can't think of them as distinct spaces because they are very much in tandem with each other. And the other historian that I spoke to, who was an American historian, he was like, I learned more about my grandmother through the letters than I did about my grandfather, because I got to meet my grandfather and I got to hear his war stories, but to be able to read the letters. And I love what you're saying about when we are focusing on women's experiences, then we realize that there isn't this hard distinction between soldiers fighting, women home, like that. It's a symbiotic relationship.
Yes.
Yeah. So I know that you didn't write a chapter, but you and Sarah obviously were thoughtful in the themes that you wanted to put together. And I know in talking with both of you, not for the series, but just talking about the collection generally, that you were really interested in like breaking that divide between Rosie the Riveter and like just at home and sad, and to talk about other things like community and like girlhood and womanhood, and the fact that like that was kind of a selling feature, right, for some women to enlist in various ways. So you provided a really cool image. I thought maybe we could just flip over and talk about as a source that somebody could use to talk about some of these themes in their own classroom.
Yes, well, we've got, we put photographs sort of throughout the collection. Every chapter has a photograph, and the introduction and the conclusion has a photograph, because these are great in terms of, trying to get at other aspects of the story. And this is one that we considered using, and we ended up sort of not quite having enough space for it. But I really like it for lots of reasons. One of the things that I really like about it is how it's posed to tell a certain story. I think that this is aiming at parents partly, and the girls themselves, to say this, joining the in this case they're in the Royal Naval Service, joining the Navy isn't too strange and too different and too dangerous. These people are not going to go off and get shot, and they're not, as was maybe more of a worry, going to be out there all close with potentially lascivious enlisted men. It's not going to be dangerous for them that way. Look, this is just like things that you are familiar with. This is like camp or boarding school or university dormitories or something like that. This is safe and familiar. And that's part of what I really like about it. And I also really like the fact that they're having a good time all together. And it is posed, but it also fits with this other theme that we found in the collection, where so many people were writing about how, even though it was wartime, they had fun, a lot of them. And part of this seems to be about community. Community is this theme that runs throughout the collection. And it's very important to many people's memories of the war, the fact that they were together with what would become friends. And this crosses all sorts of boundaries. This is for people, young people enlisting. This is for, people in their neighborhoods. This is all over. And I think it's really, really a valuable kind of theme in the collection. One of the sources that we use writes about how this comes out of the Depression, that she'd been growing up in the Depression and she hadn't really had an opportunity to be doing things with lots of young people her age before. There was no money for, I don't know, sports or music.
Radios or Cokes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what really stood out for her was that she was away from home and with other people her age, and that was different and new and kind of wonderful. So we have this camaraderie that we think of with men in war, but was definitely a big part of women's experience too.
Yeah, when we think, or when I think of women in World War II, I have very specific images, and these young women aren't a part of that. And what's interesting is that it helps challenge these ideas that I have, the fact that they're younger, the fact that it does very much look like a dormitory, but it also is the posing of it also challenges what I normally think, that some of this camaraderie was created so that the camaraderie could happen. That, and that's a really kind of special place, because women's friendships, I don't know, I was watching something the other day. I don't feel like the trope of like women competing over men is quite as prominent as it was even like 10 years ago, but it's still there. Yeah. And we don't often see examples of female friendships, especially in the past. And it's nice to be able to think that there are these spaces where we can understand women in community in different ways than we often are kind of presented with.
Yeah, I think that's really key. Women's friendships, women's relationships are a hugely important theme in the collection and in, wider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how do you think, I had to take my glasses off because the glare was bugging me, but now we can see you. How do you think that your collection and the ways that you want to center women's voices and center themes of community and women and girls in Canada and Newfoundland, how do you think that the book as a whole can challenge the way we normally understand this period in Canadian history?
I think there's a lot of possible things there. One of the things that it sort of was maybe not brand new for me, but it sort of highlighted for me is we tend to think of the Second World War as kind of separate, that there's all these sort of distinct periods in Canadian history. And
I call them historic spaces.
Okay, historic spaces. But one of the things that seemed really key in this was the way it all obviously would, but we don't think of it that way, bleeds into each other. That the Second World War is all about the Depression and all about the First World War while it's going on. And then the war ends, but it doesn't really end for everybody. The people overseas doing humanitarian work are doing more work. There's still shortages at home and things like that. There's still, it takes time for internment to adjust. There's all these things where it bleeds into the Cold War. And so I think that's part of one of the things to think about here is to note this continuity and how these threads move within these spaces, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really great, because I mean, one of the purposes of this series is to help us challenge historic spaces, because in my experience in working in a museum as a historical interpreter, so in costume, I saw that people were just understanding these encapsulated simplistic time periods, and there were like certain symbols and guides and landmarks in those spaces, but there was no kind of robustness and there was no complexity. And I think that simplicity is taken into our classrooms because that's how people understand the past, it's not necessarily the fault of the educator. And what has been really great about this series is that Like when you were talking about the war was also at home, I think of my conversation with Rebecca Bozrart, which was the first Source Saturday video that I did on a War Breads 1918 cookbook. And then talking about Jewish women in World War II, I think about the second video I did with Andrea Eidinger about a 1950s Jewish women's cookbook. And then I think about a letter of protest from someone who was interned, a Japanese Canadian person who was interned, and then like writing the government. And I think about all these connections between the different videos, the different conversations that obviously were not planned, but that really helps demonstrate that complexity and that the ways that things build on each other in time, as we like know when we're in the present, but when we look back, that's not often the case. And so thank you for bringing that to the conversation. I think it's a really nice way to end. Thank you so much for this. How can people get the book? I mean, they probably saw some ordering information on the website, but the paperback is now out.
Right. Yeah, the paperback is out. It's published by University of British Columbia Press, so you could get it through them. But I think it's also sort of out there generally. I know everything's kind of online now, but sort of all your places where you would normally get your online books, maybe a little bit more of a shout out to the smaller bookstores rather than just Amazon and stuff. But it is on Amazon and Chapters and stuff like that. So yes, it's out there.
Yeah. And I mean, the hardcover isn't really designed for us. It's designed for libraries, but having the paperback is really great. And then there's 2 different e-publication options, which is also really great. Yeah. My book is also out with UBC Press. So I spend a lot of time on this website and I love giving them some love. I did a video series on the suffrage book series, and that was with UBC Press too. It has just been a coincidence. All of the academic books are UBC Press, but they do such great work.
They really do. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Amy. This was so wonderful. I hope people get your book. Although that just reminded me, I did notice that it said free shipping on orders over $40, and so you can get this book and my book. Yes. And you've definitely hit 40 and then you're supporting the publisher and you can be like, oh, we saw it on the video series. Thank you for this. I look forward to talking with you about your next book collection. I'm sure you're just like, okay, let's figure out the next war.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. No. Thank you again and have a great night.
Thank you. You too. It's been great. Yeah.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.